in this area or under this area. So, as I said, I mean, the last lesson you did oral narratives, sorry, characteristics of oral narratives, not oral literature, characteristics of oral narratives. And so today I want us to look at the types of oral narratives. And for some recap, for the characteristics of the narratives that we looked at, I think we talked about that oral narratives have a moral lesson. They make use of an opening formula as well as a closing formula. There's also the aspect of timelessness. There's also the aspect of use of fantasy. So all that I'm mentioning is what I believe got introduced or you were taught by Mr. Gathimbo during the last session. So for today, as I said, I want us to look at the types or the categories of oral narratives, the types or the categories of oral narratives, types, stroke categories of oral narratives. So, and before I proceed, every time we have a lesson, I want us to come or to get into the session with an objective, not just, you know, logging in and just being there for the sake of it. All right? Yeah. So come get into the session with an objective and ask yourself after the session, what will I have learned or what did I learn during the session? Can you be able to answer a question in regards to what you were taught during the lesson or during the session? So the types or categories of oral narratives. So we're going to look at six types of oral narratives. And of course, this is something that is not so new to us, because when you remember the first story that we read in Excelling Book 1, the very first time, the very first week, the first story was about trickster stories. So I want us to begin with the first type of oral narratives, which are the trickster narratives. So we're going to look at six categories or six types. So we'll begin with the trickster narratives, and then we move on to the ogre narratives or ogre stories or monster stories. Then thirdly, we are going to look at maids, M-Y-T-H-S, maids. Then number 4, we look at legends. Legends is the fourth type or the fourth category of oral narratives. Then 5th, we'll look at dilemma stories or dilemma narratives. Then 6th, we'll look at narratives known as etiological or explanatory. 6th, we look at etiological or explanatory narratives. So we'll mention each of the type or each of the category, discuss, get to understand what does this story tell us, or what does this narrative tell us? You know, what are the features of these narratives? You know, each of the story. Yeah, what are the features of a trickster narrative? What are the features of a dilemma narrative? How do you know that this story you're given, you know, if you're given a story in a question, how would you tell that this is an ogre narrative and not a trickster and not a myth and not a legend? So that's what I want us to look at. So we're saying types of oral narratives. So number one is the trickster. So let us think about the trickster narratives. What are they? Yeah. What are the features? Yeah. So, and as I said, the very, very first story we read, if you refer to the Excelling Book 1, the very, very first story is about the trickster stories. And I believe the trickster is the main, is the commonest, or I believe we've heard about it before. Yeah. So can somebody tell us what trickster narratives are all about? Somebody to tell us what trickster narratives are all about? An idea? Anybody with an idea?
We have Bryson, Joseph, and Bravis' hands are up.
So we have who and who?
Bryson Yaga,
So
Joseph Babu,
yes.
Bravin Wainaina, Samuel Kenya, quite a number of them. Click on participants on the right, you'll see them.
Okay. Bryson Yaga, have I unmuted you?
Unmute him, please.
Let me unmute you, Bryson. A minute.
Yes, yes.
Yes. Go ahead.
Trickster narratives always contains a deceiver and a duped, while the deceiver is the trickster, while the victim who is always tricked is the duped.
Very good. You done? Okay. Any other person that is correct? Any other person to add on to what was said?
Joseph Babu.
Joseph.
Yes, Babu.
Have I? Joseph,
Yes.
let me, go ahead.
So they are narratives in which one character in the story tricks another.
Good.
Then the one that tricks is usually the hero, as he teaches that wit surpasses strength.
So come up again.
So the one that tricks is usually the hero, as he teaches that wit surpasses strength.
That teaches?
That wit surpasses strength.
Okay, good. So thank you for that. So thank you for the insights. Good. So trickster narratives are narratives where one character. So you'll find that so in these stories, amongst the many characters involved in this narrative, there will always be that character who will tend to use their wit, their wit to deceive another character. So there's an aspect of deceit in that story. Yeah, there's an aspect of deceit where, as we were told, we have the deceiver who will always have some tricks played on another character who is the duped, as we have been told. So there'll be one character who is playing as the dupe or the deceiver, and then they'll play some sort of tricks so that they emerge the winner. They'll always want to emerge the winner. And mainly, we all know that in these narratives, the deceiver or the dupe, in most cases, for the narratives that we've read before, we have the hare, the hare, who is always trying to play tricks on these other animals, depending on whatever it is, or depending on the flow of the story. So there are some tricks that are involved, so that the hare emerges the winner. The hare emerges the winner, or emerges or looks to be more intelligent than the other characters that are involved in that story. So there's some sort of tricks, or there are tricks that are involved in these types of narratives. And mainly the hare, and you'll find that in most of these narratives, the dupe or the deceiver is usually a smaller animal as compared, to the other animals that are being tricked, or to the other animal that is being tricked. Yeah, so the dupe. So one of the features of trickster narrative is that in these narratives, one character will use their wits to deceive or to trick another animal, and mainly the character or the dupe will be or tends to be a smaller animal than the others. Yeah, and they'll tend to use their intelligence to deceive or to trick the other animal.
3 hands up. 3 hands up. 3 hands
Yes.
are up.
Mm-hmm.
Nixon Jero, Manuel, and Kevin Mwangi.
Yes. A minute. Which hands are up? Who and who? Linus Kamau. Linus, did I unmute you?
Yes.
Yeah,
I was asking in an exam. When you are told to explain what is trickster narratives, what are you going to write? Is it a narrative that involve a trickster animal and another character, or what?
So mainly you'll not be asked what a trickster narrative is, but rather you'll be given a story, okay? When you're given a story or a narrative, mainly the first question will be identify the type of the narrative above, giving illustrations, okay? So it is up to you. So I said we are going to look at the types of oral narratives, and we started with the trickster narrative. So if then it is a trickster narrative, then you will say this is a trickster narrative because, so then you go back to the story. So if it's a trickster narrative, there will be a trick played on some characters in that story. So it is up to you to choose or to give your illustrations in line with the events in the story, if it is a trickster narrative. So you'll say, for instance, if the story about the hare and the hyena, so it's a trickster narrative because we have the hare tricking the hyena or playing some tricks on the hyena in this and this way. You must bring out the details in which the dupe deceived the duped or the deceiver played tricks on the what? On the duped. For instance, in that case, the hyena. Okay.
Yes.
Yes. So it depends.
So it is up to us to identify the narrative. Is it a trickster or other?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yes. Okay. Any other question before you move on? Bravey, you have a question as well? Bravey.
Madam, I have a question.
Yes.
Now, is the dupe the deceiver?
Please be audible.
Okay, I'm asking.
Uh-huh.
Is the dupe the deceiver or the deceived?
Yes.
Is the dupe
the dupe or the duped?
Yeah, is he the deceiver or the deceived?
So the dupe is the deceiver, the one playing tricks, okay? And the duped is the one being deceived, or you know, the one being played tricks on.
Oh, okay.
Okay?
Yes.
Yes. Ken Kimutai, you also have a question. So can we move on? Ken.
My question is, in most trickster narratives, it involves animals. Can there also be a trickster narrative involving humans? Trickster narratives involving humans.
Humans only?
Yes.
So in most cases, we are going to look at another category of oral narrative that is known as human tales. Okay.
Yes.
Human tales are those narratives that there is no animal involved. Mainly, they'll have the humans involved. Yeah. And so specifically, if a story is involving humans, then it's known as a human tale. A human tale. So unless there's a trick in that tale or in that human tale, then that's when it becomes a trickster. But if there's no trick, then it simply remains as a story that is involving humans and not animals. Strictly those narratives that involve humans are known as human tales. But mainly in the other narratives, you will find there will be trickster narratives will mainly involve animals. Okay.
Yes.
Okay. Mainly, most of them will involve animals. Then if there's a story that is involving humans, it will be referred to as a human tale. And of course, it depends with the events in the story. That's when you will come to tell whether it's a human tale or it is another type of an oral narrative. So can we move on? So to conclude on the trickster narratives, so I want us to conclude. So
Kimadi, you have a question? Kimadi, do you have a question? Your hand is up.
Okay, let me see.
It's already unmuted.
Okay.
Kimadi, do you have a question?
Kimathi, you're on? Kimathi?
Unmute yourself, Kimadi. I think just continue.
Okay. Did I unmute you, Kimathi? Okay, so what I was saying, we conclude on the trickster narratives. So in conclusion, we say there are narratives that have the dupe and the dupes, and of course there are events that will show you there is a trick that was played on another character, and that is how you conclude that it is a trickster narrative. So we move on to the next type of narrative. A minute. Yes? Somebody is talking?
Excuse me.
Yes?
I have a question.
And
the trickster used some of his tricks to help somebody else.
Can the trickster use some of
his tricks help somebody else, like his friend?
To do what? To help somebody else, like?
His friend.
Like his friends? No. There must be, at the end of the story, there must be somebody who was fooled. So that is the aspect.
Oh.
Okay?
Thank you.
Yes. So we move on to the second category of oral narratives. That is the ogre stories. The ogre stories, or the ogre, or the monster So they are known as the ogre stories or the monster narratives. Ogre stories or monster narratives. So these are also common stories to us. And mainly they have ogres or monsters as main characters. So ogre narratives will have ogres or monsters as main characters. So that is one of the feature of this type of narrative. And you will find these ogres or these monsters and these stories with supernatural capabilities. What do I mean by supernatural capabilities? I mean that they'll tend to behave in such a way that humans cannot do. For instance, you'll find these ogres having very grotesque features. Yeah. Yes.
Oh, yeah.
A question? So you'll find these ogres having grotesque features or very grotesque. We mean very scary. You know, very scary features. Like they have you know, very long nails that will, you know, measure even you know, very long inches. You know, they have thorns on their heads. They have, you know, they are very huge. So they have very scary features. Yeah, so these ogres will tend to have very scary features, or and they'll always be the main characters. So these ogres are always the main characters. And they'll also tend to be very destructive. They want to destroy any other character that is in the story. They also tend to be very greedy, you know. They'll you know, they'll get, you know, in that narrative you'll find them getting into people's houses, you know, stealing everything they want to. They eat anything and everything, you know. They'll even eat stones, they'll even eat anything in that house. So they have some very exaggerated traits, or they have some very exaggerated attributes. Yeah, these ogres or these monsters. Then again, another feature is that much as they have those superhuman capabilities, they tend to be tricked. You know, at times they will trick the characters, or they will also tend to be tricked, or they'll fall into the trap of other characters in the story. Yeah. And so you'll find them, some of these qualities that I'm talking about, you know, they will swallow people, they will change their forms, you know, you can find it changing into a person and then again changing into something else. So that's how you tell that a story is a monster, you know, monster-like. Yeah, those ogre stories or ogre narratives. So first of all, we said these ogre narratives have ogres or monsters as the main character. So that's one of their feature. They'll have superhuman capabilities, you know, things that human beings cannot possess, you know, like, you know, or cannot do, like swallowing people, you know, eating stones, you know, some of those weird, you know, grotesque. They have grotesque features, you know, bellies that are from here up to, you know, those very scary features. You know, they tend to be greedy, they tend to be evil, they're destructive, and I believe we've read several of them even in primary school. So that is the second category of oral narratives: ogre narratives or monster narratives. Yeah. And remember we said, I believe as Mr. Katimbo was teaching you about the characteristics of these narratives, we said they tend to have a moral lesson. These narratives have a moral lesson. And so once you read every narrative, you need to think about what is the moral lesson of this story. What is the moral lesson? Because they will portray things that, you know, or things that happen. Most of these narratives portray lessons that you may learn out of the things that happen in the community or in the society. So most of these narratives tend to have moral lessons. You know, for instance, if it's an Oga narrative, you may wicked people in the society, you know, the evils that do in the society may always come back to you. And then you go back to the story. Is there anything that is alluded by that moral lesson that you come up with? So every time you read these narratives, think about the moral lessons from each of them, and then you relate. If you come up with a lesson, relate with the events in that story. So depending on whatever type of oral narrative it is, whether it's a trickster, a dilemma story, a myth, a legend. So depending, it's important that you think about the moral lesson of each of the stories that you come up with, I mean, that you read. Yeah, so that's the second category. And I wish we had, I wish somebody, or I believe we have a story in our heads about these ogres, isn't it? Or the monsters. Yeah, I believe we have a story. And we can always think about it or retell so that we have a better understanding of the same. If we have no question, you can move on to the third type of oral narrative. If there is no question, you can move into the third type of the oral narrative. So I believe there's no question. But at the end of it all, we'll have stories with questions so that we can test our understanding on the same. So the third category of oral narrative that I want us to look at are the legends. Legends, L-E-G-E-N-D-S, legends. So legends is the third category of oral narratives. And so mainly, what are the features? How can you tell in an exam that this is a legend narrative? You know, how can you tell that this is not an Oga narrative, but a legend? This is not a myth, but a legend. So what are the features of legends? So in that narrative, in that story, they will mainly give an account. They will mainly give an account of a hero or a heroine in a community. An account of a hero or a heroine in a community. So this hero in that story or this heroine happens to have done a very extraordinary thing, you know, that saved his or her members. Could be from hunger, you know, from whatever it is, you know. So they tend to do extraordinary things for their members in that society. Yeah. So legends, first, secondly, will have also superhuman abilities. These legends in these stories will tend to have superhuman abilities. Yeah. And it is through these abilities that they happen, you know, they may happen to save their people. Yeah. And so in most of these legends also, there are exaggerations. The way in which these people carry out the acts so that they emerge as heroes or heroines, the ways in which these people carry out the acts so that they are said to be a hero or a heroine, they carry out these acts in a very exaggerated way, you know. So, so you may find that the way in which they behave. For instance, we have this story about, I don't know whether you know the story about Luanda Magere. Luanda Magere in the, you know, the story about the Nandi and the Luo. Yeah, the story that involved the Nandis and the Luos, about the Luanda Magere. So you'll find that at one point in that story, there was a shadow that was pierced by a spear. Yeah, so you'll find some very extraordinary events happening in these legends or in these narratives. Some extraordinary events are happening in these narratives, and of course there are so many. And these legend narratives are believed to be true in those communities that they are told. They are believed to be true, and they believed to have existed. They are believed to have happened. Yeah, so they're about characters who were heroes or heroines in their community, and of course there are events that happened or that to these characters, or there's what these characters did for them to be termed as heroes or heroines in those communities. So you need to ask yourself, maybe in your community, is there such a story of a legend, you know? And what happened, you know? And maybe what moral lesson can you learn from that story, you know? Yeah. And what are the characters? What are the character traits of those legends in your communities, you know, that are told, you know, from those stories that are told? Yeah. From those legend stories or legend narratives, what can you learn about that community as far as the economic activities, as far as the social activities that happened? So there are so many things that you can learn from these narratives. Yeah, but mainly is to think about, how can I identify a story as a legend and not another type? Yeah. So these legends will give an account of a hero or a heroine in details. Yeah, and that is how you tell that this is a legend. You know, this is another type of a narrative. I hope we are at par. I hope we are at par, unless there is somebody who did not understand what legends are. Yes. So we are good. There's no question on the same. Nobody with a question? So then we can move on to the next type of a narrative. That is explanatory. So that is the fourth type of oral narratives. The fourth type, that is this is the fourth or the fifth? Yes, explanatory narratives. They are known as explanatory, from the word explain. Explanatory narratives, or they're also known as etiological narratives. Etiological. AETIOLOGICAL. Etiological narratives, also known as explanatory narratives, etiological or explanatory narratives. So this is also another category of oral narratives. This might be new to us. So mainly the stories, so I said they are either explanatory narratives or etiological narratives or the why stories, the why, HWY, why. So those are three terms that can be referred to this type of a narrative. So we have the explanatory, we have the etiological or the why stories, WHY, the why stories. So they're known as the why stories because they are stories that answer the question why. Why? For instance, why they explain the meaning or the existence of something. They explain the meaning or the existence of something. How something came to be. How something came to be. So for instance, we have elephants. You have stories that tell us why elephants have long noses. You know, why elephants have long noses. Other stories, you'll find another narrative giving a chronology of events as to why zebras have the black and white stripes. You know, why zebras have the black and white stripes. So the explanatory or the etiological or the why stories, they explain the meaning or the existence of something or how something came to be, you know. Yeah. So if in an exam you're given a narrative and there's that explanation of why elephants have long noses, you know, the stories about zebras, why the hyena limps, you know, why the hyena limps, why, you know, stories that explain why this condition exists. Yeah. Why the sun rises in the morning, you know, why the sun sets in the evening, why, you know. So they explain why a certain condition or a certain thing exists. So the why narrative, the etiological narratives, the explanatory narratives, and mainly, you know, some of them may be given to children or may be narrated to children to satisfy their curiosity. You'll find children asking you, why is this and this like this? Why is this and this like this? You know, so they tend to satisfy the curiosity of children. So if at an exam you're given a narrative and you ask categorize, or what category does this narrative fall? Yeah, or what type of a narrative is this? So go back to the story, read the story, think about all the types that you have read. Then after reading the story, what features are in this story? And what category do they rhyme with? Yeah. So it's up to you to know each and every, or each of these narratives and what each of them talks about, so that if you're given a story, you can be able to refer, to go back to what you learned or you've been told and relate that to the events in the story, in this narrative. So the explanatory, that's simply about them. They'll tell about the existence of something. I mean, the meaning mainly the meaning of something. So that's the explanatory. So unless there's a question, we can move on to the next category. That is the maids. Maids. M-Y-T-H-S. The maids. M-Y-T-H-S. So maids is also another category of oral narratives, maids. So again, how do you tell that a narrative is a myth when you're given such a question in an exam? You know, how do you tell that this story is a myth and not an explanatory and not an ogre story and not a trickster? So then again, you need to think about the features of maids. Yeah, features of maids. So maids again are narratives. They'll mainly give an account. They'll mainly give an account or describe the origin. Maids give an account or describe the origin of people. One, that is number one. They will explain the origin of people. They'll also explain the origin of creation. They'll also explain the origin of creation. And they'll also explain the origin of a supernatural phenomenon. They'll also explain the origin of a supernatural phenomenon. So maids explain, and mainly they talk about the origin of a people, you know, of a certain creation. And the simplest way to talk about maids, or if you can think about, for instance, the story about the origin of the Akikoyo. The origin of the Akikoyo, there is that story that was told or that has been told every time. You know, if your sister, I don't know whether it's in a history, it's in a history subject, the origin of the Akikoyo, or the origin of the Abagusi, or the origin of the whatever. But the common one, or the commonest story about the origin of the Akikoyo, you know, that's a myth, explaining the origin of a people or of a certain creation. Yeah. So for those of us who know that story about the origin of the Akikoyo, you know, that involves the story about the Mugumo tree, the Mukorwe, Wanyagadanga, the daughters, you know, the Akikoyo, the Airimo, their, you know, there's that story about the origin, how the Akikoyo came to be, yeah, or how the Akikoyo came to be. So that story that explains that origin, you know, the events that happened, this and this, this and this, and this, and the Akikoyo came to be. So that is simply a myth, a myth. And I'm not only saying that you will find that story only in the exam for you to know it's a myth. No, look at the story. Is it talking about the origin of a certain creation? Yeah. The origin of a certain community, you know? So it's about, and it's very, maids are normally sacred in nature, you know? They'll talk about, and they'll also talk about, they'll also have those supernatural beings. They'll also have supernatural beings. And they'll explain the relationship between the human beings, maybe in that community, and the supernatural being or the supernatural beings. So I believe in our communities, we've also heard about such stories or such narratives, the maids. Yeah. And so you can also think about them, or maybe ask from maybe people who are older than you about these stories that explain the origin of communities, yeah, of people, yeah, of certain supernatural phenomena, yeah. So, and then now you can see how you can see how these stories are turn out to be myths or are categorized under myths. So that is the second last category that I want us to look at, because the last one is dilemma. Yes, dilemma narratives. So I want us to mention something small about the dilemma narratives. Dilemma narratives. So that's the last category that you're going to look at. Dilemma. So when you're in a dilemma, I believe we all know the meaning of a dilemma. Is when you are served with two alternatives, you know, or rather you're caught up in a very tight situation that you don't know whether to take this route or the other. Yeah. I don't know whether you've ever found yourself in a dilemma, whether in school or at home. Maybe these two situations really need you to come up with a very good choice for you to take either of them. Yeah, and it's always not very easy to make a judgment on which position to take. Yeah, so the choice is not always easy to make and really requires a sound judgment for you to make it. Yeah, so the same case when it comes to dilemma narratives. So these narratives will present a situation where a character has to make a choice between two or more alternatives. So these dilemma narratives present a situation where a character will have to make a choice between two, and at times maybe even more alternatives. Yeah. So then of course there are events, you know, so in that narrative we find the story is given and the events presented, or rather the instances presented with to this character. Yeah. For instance, the story about the hyena and how the hyena found himself in a dilemma, and that's why he ended up limping, you know. So these narratives will offer you choices. Yeah, will offer you choices between an alternative, and that's how you are able to identify that this is a dilemma narrative and not a monster narrative, and not a trickster, yeah, and not an ideological, because the events in this story prevent this character. Yeah, the events in the story represents this character with choices, yeah, between an alternative, between two alternatives or more. And of course, at the end of the story, the character so we'll have to make a decision, and of course you'll have to be presented with, you'll also have to think about the moral lesson from that story. Yeah, and how is that lesson related to the events in that story? So it's simply about being in a dilemma, just like you will get yourself in a dilemma. So is the story presented, or so is the narrative presented? Yeah, so then that's what will make you differentiate a dilemma narrative from another type of a narrative. There has to be a choice. There has to be a choice that a character is presented with to make between two or more alternatives. Yeah, so that is simply what we mean by dilemma narratives. That is simply what we mean by dilemma narratives. And so we have mentioned at least six types of oral narratives, each with their descriptions, each with what they entail. Yeah. And so from what we learned in the characteristics of oral narratives, what we learned in the characteristics of oral narratives is what you will mainly find in all these types of narratives that we've talked about. Mainly you will find them there. And after that, after you being able to identify those characteristics, then you must be able to know what type of a story is this. From the features that we mentioned for each of the stories, I said what we learned in the characteristics of oral narratives is what you will find in these types of oral narratives that I've talked about. All those features, you know, an August story will have an opening formula. Once upon a time, there lived a girl in the village. This girl was married. And one day, an ogre came by and this happened. Yeah, the ogre sang a song to scare away the girl and her children. You know, and this. Finally, what I'm saying is all those characteristics that you learned about oral narratives you'll find them in all these types of stories that we've looked at, and all of them must have a moral lesson, other than say Maids, because Maids mainly will be about you know, Maids mainly are believed to be true by that community in which they originate. Yeah, so Maids will tend not to have also an opening formula, will not tend to have a closing formula, will tend not to have a moral lesson, because mainly they are believed to be true. And remember you said, so in other words, there is no fantasy. Yeah, remember you said these stories will make use of fantasy. You know, they'll take you from world of reality to the world of fantasy, and that is why you will find an ogre swallowing a wife and a husband and her children. You know, so you'll be taken into that world of fantasy. You know, you will find you will also find a legend, you know, who did a very extraordinary thing that you cannot even think about. Yeah, you will find so there's use of fantasy in all. You'll find all these use of fantasy in all these stories, and that's why I'm saying all the characteristics that you looked at with the teacher are going to be found. You know, there's use of personification. You will find the hare talking, you know, telling the hyena that you have to go to the river so that this and this and this. as he tries to trick the hyena. So the personification, yeah, where human attributes are given to inanimate objects. So you will find, yeah, you will find the hyena doing things that human beings do, cooking, you know, all those other activities that they might be involved. So it depends with the events of this, the events of the story. So what I mean is, when you're given a narrative, be assured there will never miss a question on what type of a narrative it is. And of course, you don't just say that it is an Oga narrative and stop there. No. You go back to the narrative and illustrate your answer. It's because, you know, there is the account of what this Oga did, you know, probably how it swallowed, probably how it tricked somebody, probably how it, so you have to give an account of the event in the story that makes you, or that will satisfy the examiner, yeah, depending on whatever category of a narrative it falls under. So you'll never lack a question on the type of a narrative. You'll never lack a question on the characteristics of oral narratives that are found in any of the stories. You'll never lack a question about the moral lesson, you know, character traits of the characters found in that narrative. Also question about what economic activities do you learn, or what economic activities you learn from the community in this narrative. So as you read the narrative, all those things that are happening there, social activities, economic activities, you must also consider, you must also bring that to your attention. You must bring that to your attention. The economic activities that you learn from the community in that narrative, the social activities that you learn from the community or that are practiced in the community, in the narrative that you are given, whatever type of a narrative it is. So farming, you know, you'll find that there was farming, that was swimming, you know, you might find swimming, you might find hunting and gathering, you might find sorcery, you might find, so depending on whatever activity it is, yeah, you must also think about all that, yeah. So what I'm saying is, you must pay attention to these characteristics of oral narratives, as well as the types. Can you be able to identify an Oga story, an explanatory narrative, you know, a legend, a myth, a trickster? So meaning you have to know the features of each of these narratives for you to be able to conclude that, this is an Oga, that this is a trickster story, yeah. So you need to think about all that you said. And since maybe we might not be able to give as many details as, or rather, you know, if we were in class, maybe we would have had each of the narrative given an illustration of a story or an example of a story, yeah. Would have you participate in giving a legend narrative from your community, you know, a trickster that you know of, an explanatory that you know of, you know, a maid that you know of. So of course you can make use of your internet to get the samples or to get more samples, yeah. Think about what story it is, what narrative it is, yeah. And again, you may be asked, remember, in oral literature, it's about performance. It's about performance. So when we were getting introduced, we looked at the introduction to oral literature. And at this point, we are looking at the genres of oral literature. That's why we started with the oral narratives, because that is the first genre of oral literature, oral narratives. And then we move on to songs, stroke poetry, oral songs, stroke poetry, and then move on to the short forms. So for now, you're looking at the oral narratives. And mainly, that's what I said, in oral literature, it's more of performance. So we also find a question on, and I believe we looked at the types of audience in this performance or under oral literature that you might be tested on. Yeah. So in that narrative you're given, you might find a question on how you will tell that the audience or the people being given this story are active. How can you tell the difference between an active or a passive audience? How can you tell the difference between an active or a passive audience? Yeah. So if a story is being narrated, because right now we are looking at oral narratives. If a narrative is being narrated, how do you tell that the audience is attentive? You know, are they sitting in an upright posture leaning forward? You know, if they are making eye contact with the performer, if they are nodding in agreement with the performer, on instances where they need to agree, and shake their head on instances where they need to disagree. You know, are they laughing at comic situations in the story, or humor scenarios in the story, and what humor is it that, you know? So you must be able to also, you must think about, I mean, you must also be able to answer the question on active or passive audience. You know, how do you tell the audience is not listening? How do you tell the audience is listening? Yeah, so those are some of other questions you'll find in the question on oral narratives. Yeah, how also the narration can be made interesting. I believe, I don't know whether all of us have learned that, how the performance of a story can be made interesting. Yeah. So, but mainly the objective, today's objective was for us to know the types of oral narratives. And I think the 6 of them are the major ones that we've looked at today. And they're the ones that will be tested in the exam. Yeah, in addition, of course, to so many other aspects that are related to oral narratives, including the characteristics. Yeah. So we should be able to identify what narrative it is that you've been given in an exam. You know, think about the activities that the people in that community did. Yeah, think about the moral lesson. And when you're giving the moral lesson, don't just state the lesson. Don't just say that don't put all your eggs in one basket and then stop there. So we said the moral lesson can be given in a saying form or in a proverb form. Yeah, but don't just state that saying. You must go back to the story and illustrate how that saying is related to the events in the story and bring out the characters in the story. Yeah, that made you, or the events in the story that made you come up with that moral lesson, or with that, you know, proverb that you gave as a form of a moral lesson. So it's important that we know how to give these moral lessons, not just stating them, but explaining them with illustrations from the story or from the narrative. Yeah. So unless there's a question, I feel like we can end the lesson, and then I'll give work to your respective groups that entails what you have done today and what you did with Mr. Kathimbo on the characteristics, and also, questions, questions that you expect rather in these oral narratives, questions that you expect. So look at those questions. You can get more information from your books, if you have those oral literature books. The internet can also help you, and of course, get valid information from the internet, or get relevant information from the internet on the same, so that you're able to answer those questions. I hope we have all understood or gotten the objective of today's lesson. Unless there's a question, I don't see any hand up. Do you have anybody with a question? Anybody with a question? Anybody with a question? Yes, Linus. Yes, Linus, did I unmute you? Linus? Go ahead.
So I wanted to ask, in these monster or ogre narratives, what is the main ending of these monsters? What is the future, or what is the ending in this? What is the ending of these monsters in the end of the story? Do they die, or is it another human being or another character who saves the society of the community? Yeah, that is my question.
Okay, so the ending of ogre narratives, yeah?
Yes. Or these monsters that are in these stories, what are their endings? What are their endings? What happens to them in most of the stories? That is my question. Yes.
Okay. Fine. So at the end of the story, in these ogre narratives, at the end of the story in these ogre narratives, so the ogre, first of all, we said they are usually very greedy, they're usually very destructive, and they're usually very evil. So at the end of the story, they can emerge to be victorious, okay?
Yes.
So they can emerge to have tricked, maybe that character in that story. But at the same time, they can also be tricked. At the same time, they can also be tricked by the characters in that story. Okay?
Yes.
Yes. So, but mainly they represent the evil people in our society. They represent the wicked people in our society, and those people who are up to no good for others. Yeah. So they can be tricked, and they can also emerge to harm the characters.
To have been destroyed.
Yes.
Exactly. I have understood. Thank you.
Okay. We also have another person who is any other person with we have Mohammed. Is it Mohammed? 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 Huh? Come up again, Mohammed. Mohammed, I can't hear you. Mohammed, I can't hear you.
I'm not able to trick it.
So let's do this, huh? So we have Ali. Anybody else with a question? Anybody else? Tom, you have a question?
Yes, apart from oral literature, what are the other types of literature that we have?
So remember, we started with the introduction to oral literature. We defined what oral literature is. We looked at the importance of oral literature. And next is what we looked at recently, that is the genres of oral literature. So we began with the oral narratives, that is one. Second, we have oral songs stroke oral poetry. Second, we have oral songs stroke oral poetry. Third, we have short forms in oral literature. So those are the three genres of oral literature that we should look at. Okay? Okay? So those are the three genres of oral literature. Tom, you have a question? Tom? Tom? Okay, let me see if I'll unmute this one. Lennox?
Excuse me, please, Chair.
Yes?
I have a question. Let us say if we have there's an ogre in a village, then
There's an ogre?
In a village you have an ogre. Then a person comes and rescues the people by killing the ogre. Will that narrative be an ogre narrative or a legend narrative?
That person comes and kills the ogre.
Yeah.
Of course it is an ogre narrative, because you see, before that ogre is killed, you know, the story does not just start and ends. There are events in that story. So it is the events in that story that will help you know whether it's an ogre narrative. But as long as a narrative has these ogres or these monsters, an ogre or a monster, and the ogre did this, did that, did this, did that, and eventually got killed, then mainly that is an ogre narrative.
Okay, thanks.
It's just I wanted to ask, what's the difference between a myth and an explanation story?
A myth and the explanatory.
Yes.
So myths, yes, I know why you asked that question. It's because both of them tend to give the existence of something, isn't it?
Yes.
But so in a myth, there is that aspect of relationship. There's that aspect of a supernatural being or being sacred in nature, giving about people mainly. We talk about the origin of people or of a certain creation or of a certain supernatural phenomenon. Unlike the explanatory will mainly talk about the existence of something, not any sacred related, not any people or creation related, but just explaining the existence of something. Maids will be sacred related, you know, there is the involvement of a supernatural being. Yeah. They'll explain the origin of people, history of people. I think we didn't mention that in the explanatory or the etiological. The etiological will mainly answer why, but maids are a bit broad and are sacred in nature. Yeah, and mainly they'll describe the early history of a certain people, the early history of a certain people, you know, of a certain creation. And there's that involvement of a supernatural being. Yeah, you know, like I talked about the origin of the Akikoyo. We are told Ngai commanded, you know, the Akikoyo to sacrifice this and this. There's that involvement of a supernatural being in Maids, unlike the explanatory ones. Andrew? Andrew, you have a question? Andrew? So we are done? I believe there is no other question.